The story of the Yak-7 begins in the turbulent years just before the outbreak of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Air Force faced a challenge common to all major powers, balancing the need for frontline combat aircraft with the need to train thousands of new pilots. The Yakovlev Design Bureau, under the leadership of Alexander Yakovlev, was already gaining recognition with the Yak-1, a promising modern fighter that had entered development in 1939. But Yakovlev also understood that without a dedicated advanced trainer, new pilots would struggle to make the transition from basic flight training to operating high-performance combat aircraft. It was within this context that the Yak-7 was conceived, not as a fighter at all, but as a two-seat trainer derived from the Yak-1. The original concept was simple: take the single-seat fighter airframe and modify it to carry an instructor and a student. In this way, young aviators could be trained on an aircraft that shared the flight characteristics of a true frontline fighter, preparing them for combat units more efficiently. The initial design was known as the Yak-7 UTI, the abbreviation for Uchebno-Trenirovochny Istrebitel, or trainer fighter. The Yak-7 UTI retained much of the Yak-1's layout: a low-wing monoplane with retractable landing gear, a liquid-cooled inline engine, and a wooden airframe with mixed construction materials to save on scarce aluminum. The major difference was the lengthened fuselage to accommodate the second cockpit, with the instructor seated behind the trainee. The rear cockpit was fitted with full flight controls, allowing the instructor to take over if needed. Early prototypes were tested in 1940 and revealed a machine that was stable, forgiving, and easier to handle than the Yak-1, making it suitable for advanced training. But history soon intervened. With the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union faced a catastrophic shortage of combat aircraft. Hundreds of fighters and bombers were destroyed on the ground during the first days of the invasion, and the Red Air Force desperately sought to replace losses. In this environment, the Yak-7's sturdy design attracted attention for reasons its creators had not originally intended. Engineers and commanders realized that with modest modifications, the trainer could be adapted into a fully armed, single-seat frontline fighter. This shift from trainer to fighter was emblematic of the Soviet wartime approach: improvisation under pressure. The Yak-7's large, strong airframe could accept additional armament and fuel without compromising structural integrity. Moreover, production facilities were already tooled to manufacture the Yak-7 UTI, meaning that converting the design into a fighter could be done more quickly than starting a completely new program. Yakovlev's bureau, working under enormous pressure, began redesigning the two-seat trainer into a single-seat combat aircraft, the aircraft that would become the Yak-7A and later Yak-7B. The transformation was not without challenges. Removing the instructor's cockpit and converting the space into additional fuel storage required adjustments in weight distribution and center of gravity. Armament was strengthened from a simple machine gun configuration to include 20mm cannon, giving the Yak-7 real striking power against both enemy fighters and ground targets. At the same time, engineers sought to maintain the qualities that had made the Yak-7 UTI appealing as a trainer: stability, durability, and relatively forgiving handling. In this way, the Yak-7 emerged as a unique hybrid, an aircraft born as a trainer but repurposed as a frontline fighter due to necessity. This origin shaped both its strengths and limitations. It was heavier and less agile than the Yak-1 or later Yak-9, but it proved rugged, versatile, and relatively easy to produce. In the desperate years of 1941-1942, those qualities mattered as much as raw performance. The Yak-7 thus became one of the rare cases in aviation history where a trainer aircraft was successfully adapted into a combat fighter. It was not planned to dominate the skies, but to fill the immediate and urgent need for reliable fighters. In doing so, it demonstrated the adaptability of Soviet design philosophy during the darkest moments of the war, when survival depended on making the most of available resources. The origins of the Yak-7 therefore encapsulate the dual pressures facing Soviet aviation: the peacetime need for pilot training and the wartime demand for combat aircraft. It was this dual identity, trainer and fighter, that would define its place in the Soviet arsenal, bridging the gap between preparation and battle, and ultimately ensuring that thousands of pilots flew into combat in machines derived from an aircraft once meant to keep them safe in training skies. The transition of the Yak-7 from a trainer to a combat aircraft required rigorous prototype work and testing, under conditions that left little room for error. When the decision was made in late 1941 to adapt the Yak-7 UTI into a frontline fighter, the Yakovlev Design Bureau immediately set to work on prototypes that would demonstrate whether this idea was practical. The urgency of the war meant that what would normally take years of development had to be compressed into months. The first prototypes, known as Yak-7A, removed the second cockpit and used the space to carry additional fuel tanks and radio equipment. These early models retained the overall airframe and layout of the trainer, but were armed with a synchronized 20mm Shvak cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 7.62mm Shkas machine guns mounted in the nose. Engineers also reinforced the landing gear and modified the canopy for improved visibility, as combat experience with the Yak-1 had already shown the critical importance of situational awareness in dogfights. Test flights of the Yak-7A began in late 1941. Pilots quickly noticed that the aircraft was heavier than the Yak-1, with slightly reduced agility, but also more stable and robust in handling. Its larger fuel capacity gave it extended range compared to its predecessor, a valuable feature at a time when Soviet air bases were often forced to relocate or operate far from the front. The stability made it an easier aircraft to fly for new pilots, a hidden advantage in the chaotic environment of 1941 and 1942 when inexperienced crews were rushed into combat after minimal training. The Yak-7A prototypes also highlighted some shortcomings. The aircraft's weight limited its climb rate and top speed, which were both inferior to the German Messerschmitt Bf 109F that dominated the Eastern Front at that time. In response, Yakovlev's team introduced improvements that led to the Yak-7B. This variant upgraded the armament by replacing the nose-mounted Shkas machine guns with 12.7mm Berezin UBS heavy machine guns, offering significantly greater firepower against both aircraft and lightly armored ground targets. Armor protection for the pilot was also increased, reflecting the brutal combat realities on the Eastern Front, where survivability often depended on withstanding the first burst of enemy fire. In early 1942, production models of the Yak-7A began rolling off assembly lines, soon followed by the Yak-7B. These aircraft underwent state trials that confirmed their viability for combat service. Despite being heavier and less maneuverable than the Yak-1, the Yak-7B was praised for its ruggedness, ease of maintenance, and improved armament. It could be repaired quickly in field conditions, and its forgiving handling characteristics meant that pilots transitioning from training to combat could adapt more readily than with more demanding aircraft. One of the most important aspects of the Yak-7's development was the speed with which it went from prototype to frontline service. In many Western aircraft programs, years of testing would separate prototype flights from squadron deliveries. For the Yak-7, the interval was measured in months. By the spring of 1942, Yak-7 fighters were already equipping combat regiments, a testament to the wartime pressure that drove Soviet industry to prioritize speed of production over perfection of design. Engine testing was another critical factor. The Yak-7 used the Klimov M105 series liquid-cooled V12 engine, the same power plant found in the Yak-1. Engineers experimented with modifications of the M105 to improve performance, but the limitations of available Soviet engine technology meant that the Yak-7 could never match the power-to-weight ratio of its German adversaries. Nonetheless, it was considered adequate, and the advantages of using a standardized, proven engine outweighed the drawbacks of limited performance. Pilot reports from testing and early operational use underscored the aircraft's practicality. Many noted that while the Yak-7 could not outturn or outclimb the Bf 109, it could absorb significant damage and still return home, a crucial trait in an air war where losses were heavy and replacements often inexperienced. Its stability made it a steady gun platform, increasing the chances that bursts of fire would hit their target. These qualities cemented its place in Soviet doctrine as a workhorse rather than a thoroughbred, capable of meeting the urgent needs of the moment. Thus, the Yak-7's prototype and testing era was defined by speed, improvisation, and adaptation. It was not a fighter born of luxury or long refinement, but of immediate necessity, shaped by the realities of war and the constraints of Soviet industry. Its success lay not in outperforming enemy fighters on paper, but in providing a practical, producible, and survivable aircraft for an air force fighting for survival. The Yak-7's formal entry into combat service came in the spring and summer of 1942, a period when the Soviet Air Force was still reeling from massive losses and desperately trying to stabilize the front. Unlike many experimental aircraft that entered production in small numbers before disappearing, the Yak-7 quickly became a significant presence in Soviet fighter regiments. Production at the Gaz-292 factory in Saratov accelerated, with hundreds of aircraft delivered directly to frontline units. The urgency of war meant that pilots often received their new fighters just days before being thrown into combat. The first regiments to operate the Yak-7 were drawn from units already familiar with Yakovlev aircraft. Transitioning from the Yak-1 to the Yak-7 was relatively smooth, as the two shared many design features. Pilots quickly noticed differences. The Yak-7 was heavier and slightly slower, but it offered increased firepower and better protection. Its larger fuselage provided more fuel capacity, granting it longer range, an asset in sectors where Soviet bases were distant from the front or when escorting bombers on deep strikes. Combat trials during the Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942 became the Yak-7's first true test. German air superiority was still formidable, with the Luftwaffe fielding the Bf-109F and G variants in large numbers. Soviet pilots in Yak-7s learned to rely on tactics that exploited the aircraft's strengths. While they could not climb or dive as quickly as German fighters, Yak-7s proved sturdy in head-on engagements, their 20mm cannon and heavy machine guns capable of inflicting serious damage in a single burst. The aircraft's ability to take punishment and remain controllable meant that many pilots survived encounters that might have been fatal in less robust machines. Reactions from frontline pilots were mixed but generally favorable given the circumstances. Veterans noted that the Yak-7 required a more measured style of combat compared to lighter, more agile fighters. Instead of tight turning duels, Yak-7 pilots were encouraged to use coordinated group tactics, focusing on firepower and stability. For novice airmen, this approach often made the Yak-7 a more forgiving mount. New pilots found the controls less demanding than those of more temperamental aircraft like the Le-GG-3, and they appreciated its stable handling during takeoff and landing, especially from rough frontline airstrips. Reports from commanders praised the Yak-7's reliability. Maintenance crews valued its straightforward construction and the fact that it could be kept operational with relatively simple field repairs. The wooden elements of its airframe, while less durable than all-metal designs, allowed for rapid patching. This was critical in wartime conditions where aircraft often flew multiple sorties per day and sustained frequent damage from enemy fire. By late 1942, the Yak-7B variant had become the standard. It addressed some of the weaknesses of the early Yak-7A with improved armament and armor protection. Many regiments regarded the Yak-7B as an equal or even superior to the Yak-1 in operational use. Its heavier weapons gave Soviet pilots confidence against bombers and ground targets, while its longer range allowed it to escort formations farther than earlier Yak models. Although it remained slightly inferior in pure performance to the latest German fighters, Soviet pilots compensated through numbers, coordination, and increasingly effective air-ground integration. The Yak-7 also began to see wider deployment in mixed roles. In addition to pure air superiority missions, it was used for close air support and ground attack, particularly during the Stalingrad campaign and later operations in 1943. Pilots used its stability as a firing platform to strafe German troop concentrations, artillery positions, and supply convoys. These missions were hazardous, exposing aircraft to flak and small arms fire, but the Yak-7's durability again proved an advantage. By 1943, the Yak-7 was present in virtually every major Soviet operation, from defensive battles to counteroffensives. It did not define the air war on its own, but it filled a critical gap during a transitional phase when Soviet aviation was rebuilding from catastrophic early losses. In service, the Yak-7 bridged the gap between earlier underperforming designs like the Le-GG-3 and more refined fighters such as the Yak-9. The entry of the Yak-7 into service thus represented not only the adaptation of a trainer into a fighter, but also the practical Soviet philosophy of wartime production. The Red Air Force needed fighters that could be built quickly, maintained easily, and flown effectively by a rapidly expanding pool of pilots. In that role, the Yak-7 succeeded. It may not have won duels on technical merit alone, but it gave Soviet aviators the tools to fight, survive, and gradually wrest back control of the skies. As the Yak-7 settled into regular combat service through 1942 and 1943, its operational use broadened and its reputation among Soviet airmen became firmly established. Unlike the glamorous reputation that attached itself to some of the war's premier fighters, the Yak-7 was regarded as a dependable workhorse, flown in every type of mission demanded by the Red Air Force at a time when flexibility was often the key to survival. In air-to-air combat, the Yak-7 proved itself as a capable, if not exceptional, fighter. Against the Messerschmitt Bf-109F and early G models, it often struggled in climb rate and top speed, but its heavier firepower compensated when engagements closed to short range. Pilots learned to avoid prolonged vertical maneuvering contests with German fighters, instead relying on coordinated group attacks and head-on passes. In these situations, the Yak-7's stability as a firing platform and its 20mm cannon allowed it to inflict decisive strikes with short bursts. Soviet after-action reports frequently mentioned German aircraft being brought down in frontal exchanges, a tactic that capitalized on the Yak's ruggedness and its ability to withstand damage to its wooden frame and steel armor plating. The Yak-7 was also increasingly employed in mixed missions, particularly ground attack. During the battles around Stalingrad and later in the Kursk campaign, Yak-7 squadrons were tasked with low-level strafing runs against German supply columns, artillery batteries, and troop positions. While not designed as a dedicated assault aircraft like the Il-2 Sturmovik, the Yak-7's heavy machine guns and cannon were effective against lightly armored targets. It could also carry small bomb loads, typically two 50-kilo or 100-kilo bombs, allowing it to disrupt enemy movements and provide direct battlefield support. These missions, though effective, came at a cost, as Yak-7s flying at low altitude were vulnerable to concentrated German flak and machine gun fire. By 1943, the Red Air Force had begun to integrate air-ground coordination on a larger scale, and the Yak-7 played a supporting role in this doctrinal evolution. Fighter regiments were tasked not only with securing air superiority, but also with immediate battlefield tasks in support of Soviet ground offensives. The Yak-7's versatility made it an ideal choice for such missions. Its ability to transition quickly from escort duty to ground attack sorties provided commanders with a flexible tool at a time when Soviet forces were shifting from defense to large-scale offensives. Losses in combat were significant but not disproportionate compared to other Soviet fighters of the period. While German aircraft often held the technical edge, the Soviet advantage lay in numerical superiority and relentless pressure. By mid-1943, Soviet production facilities were delivering hundreds of Yak fighters per month, including the Yak-7 alongside the newer Yak-9. This meant that while individual Yak-7s might not outperform their adversaries, they contributed to a growing cumulative weight of Soviet air power that wore down the Luftwaffe over time. Pilot reactions to the Yak-7 varied depending on experience and role. New pilots appreciated the aircraft's forgiving handling characteristics, which reduced accidents during training and operational sorties. Veterans, however, sometimes criticized its lack of agility compared to the Yak-1 or its successor, the Yak-9. Yet even they recognized its value as a reliable combat platform, especially in missions requiring endurance, stability, and durability. Maintenance crews echoed this sentiment, noting that the Yak-7 was easier to repair and keep flying than many of its contemporaries, a fact of great importance in the resource-limited Soviet war economy. By the summer of 1943, as the Battle of Kursk unfolded, Yak-7s flew in both air defense and offensive roles. They escorted Il-2 formations, striking German armored spearheads, intercepted Luftwaffe bombers attempting to disrupt Soviet supply lines, and conducted direct strikes against frontline positions. Although overshadowed in numbers by the Il-2 in ground attack roles and by newer Yak-9s in fighter regiments, the Yak-7 remained a key component of the Soviet air arsenal during one of the war's decisive turning points. The adaptability of the Yak-7 also meant that it continued to evolve in combat use. Some regiments equipped with the Yak-7 began to specialize in bomber escort missions, taking advantage of its longer range to accompany PE-2 dive bombers or Il-4 long-range aircraft on raids deep into German-held territory. In these missions, the Yak-7's heavier armament proved valuable against enemy bombers and twin-engine fighters, even if it remained vulnerable in duels with the latest Bf-109G or FW-190 variants. In sum, the Yak-7's combat role was defined by flexibility rather than specialization. It fought as a fighter, served as a bomber escort, carried out ground attack missions, and even performed limited reconnaissance and supply dropping tasks when necessary. While never the most advanced machine in the sky, its ability to adapt to the rapidly shifting conditions of the Eastern Front ensured that it remained relevant throughout 1942 and 1943, bridging the transition to newer designs and proving that an aircraft born as a trainer could hold its own as a frontline combat machine. The evolution of the Yak-7 did not stop with its first conversion into a combat fighter. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Soviet engineers continued to refine the design, producing a number of variants that reflected both battlefield needs and the broader technological development of the Yakovlev fighter family. These modifications highlight the adaptability of the Yak-7 airframe and the pragmatic Soviet approach of extracting the maximum possible utility from a proven design. The first significant step in this process was the Yak-7B, which became the main production variant by mid-1942. It featured heavier armament, replacing the two 7.62 mm KS machine guns with 12.7 mm Berezin UBS heavy machine guns, alongside the central 20 mm Schwecke cannon. This change gave the aircraft the firepower to penetrate the armor of German bombers and inflict serious damage on enemy fighters with shorter bursts. Armor protection for the pilot and fuel tanks was also increased, addressing the high attrition rates seen in the early months of combat. The Yak-7B was built in large numbers and represented the standard frontline Yak-7 fighter until production shifted toward the Yak-9. Recognizing the need for flexibility, several experimental variants were developed. One such adaptation was the Yak-7V, a two-seat trainer version reintroduced when it became clear that the Red Air Force still required advanced training aircraft even during wartime. Ironically, the Yak-7 returned to its original purpose in this form, serving as a stepping stone for pilots before transitioning to Yak-1s, Yak-9s, or Lavochkin fighters. By 1943, Yak-7Vs were widely used in flight schools, reflecting how the line between combat and training needs remained fluid throughout the conflict. Another noteworthy variant was the Yak-7DI, sometimes referred to as the direct forerunner of the Yak-9. This model incorporated structural improvements, weight reduction, and greater use of metal components in the fuselage. It was equipped with additional fuel tanks, extending its operational range even further. The Yak-7DI marked a critical stage in the transition from the Yak-7 family to the Yak-9, demonstrating how incremental development could result in an aircraft capable of matching or surpassing its adversaries in performance. Specialized modifications were also attempted for reconnaissance and ground attack roles. Some Yak-7s were equipped with cameras for tactical reconnaissance, using their stability and endurance to survey enemy lines. In the ground attack role, while never as heavily armored as the IL-2, certain Yak-7s were fitted with underwing bomb racks for 100 kilos or 200 kilo bombs, or rails for RS-82 rockets. These adaptations allowed the aircraft to serve as a multi-role platform when needed, especially during offensives where every available aircraft was pressed into ground support missions. Production numbers also reflect the Yak-7's significance. Between 1941 and 1944, over 6,000 Yak-7s were built, including fighters, trainers, and experimental variants. This large-scale output demonstrates both the demand for the aircraft and the efficiency with which Soviet industry could adapt an existing design to meet shifting operational requirements. The Yak-7 was not produced in the same quantities as the Yak-9, which ultimately became the most numerous Soviet fighter, but it bridged a critical gap during the transitional years of the war. Internationally, the Yak-7 did not see widespread export during the war. Unlike the Yak-9, which was later supplied to several Allied nations, the Yak-7 remained largely confined to Soviet use. However, its development experience and lessons fed directly into designs that would see broader post-war deployment. In this sense, its global influence was indirect, shaping the Yakovlev lineage that became central to Soviet aviation doctrine during and after the war. By 1944, the Yak-7 was gradually being phased out of frontline service. The Yak-9, lighter, faster, and more adaptable, had taken over as the standard Yakovlev fighter. Nevertheless, Yak-7s continued to serve in secondary roles, including training, reconnaissance, and home defense duties. Many remained in service until the war's end, particularly in units where the supply of newer aircraft was limited. The technological evolution of the Yak-7 illustrates a pattern common in Soviet wartime aviation: pragmatic adaptation rather than radical innovation. From trainer to fighter, from escort to ground attack, and finally into the foundation for the Yak-9, the Yak-7 demonstrated how a single design could be stretched across multiple roles. Its variants not only kept it relevant, but also ensured that the Soviet Air Force had the flexibility to respond to the ever-changing conditions of the Eastern Front. In retrospect, the Yak-7 stands as an aircraft that bridged two worlds. It was simultaneously a reflection of the desperate improvisation of 1941 and a stepping stone toward the more refined Soviet fighters that would dominate by 1944. Its variants and adaptations ensured it remained a vital component of Soviet aviation during a crucial phase of the war, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, versatility, and technological progression. The legacy of the Yak-7 is inseparable from its unusual origin and its wartime service. Unlike many fighters of the Second World War, it was never intended to be a frontline aircraft. It emerged out of necessity, a product of improvisation and adaptation, and in that respect it reflects the broader story of the Soviet Union's struggle for survival during the early years of the German invasion. In evaluating its impact, one must first recognize the scale of its contribution. More than 6,000 Yak-7s were produced between 1941 and 1944, a substantial figure that ensured its presence on nearly every sector of the Eastern Front during some of the war's most critical battles. From the desperate defense of Stalingrad to the massive confrontation at Kursk, Yak-7 squadrons flew air-to-air missions, ground attacks, bomber escorts, and reconnaissance sorties. They did not dominate the skies, but they provided the Red Air Force with the reliable backbone it needed to regain balance after the devastation of 1941. The aircraft's design philosophy also left a long-term imprint on Soviet aviation. The Yak-7 proved that even a machine born as a trainer could be reshaped into a competent combat fighter. This adaptability embodied the Soviet wartime approach: prioritize rapid production, ruggedness, and simplicity over cutting-edge performance. Pilots may have acknowledged that the Yak-7 was slower or less agile than the Bf-109 or the FW-190, but they also recognized that it could be repaired quickly, flown by relatively inexperienced airmen, and endure punishment in combat. These qualities mattered in a war of attrition, where maintaining a steady supply of operational aircraft and trained crews often proved decisive. The Yak-7's legacy is also intertwined with its role as the bridge to the Yak-9. Without the Yak-7's development, there would have been no smooth transition to the more advanced Yak-9, which went on to become the most produced Soviet fighter of the war. Many of the lessons learned from the Yak-7's shortcomings, its weight, limited climb performance, and fuel distribution, directly informed improvements incorporated into the Yak-9. In this sense, the Yak-7's historical significance lies not only in its own combat record, but also in its role as a developmental stepping stone. From a cultural perspective, the Yak-7 has often been overshadowed by its siblings. The Yak-1 was remembered as the first successful Yakovlev fighter. The Yak-3 earned renown as a nimble dogfighter, and the Yak-9 became famous for its sheer numbers and versatility. The Yak-7, by contrast, occupied a transitional role, and this has meant that it is less celebrated in popular memory. Yet for the thousands of pilots who flew it, and for the ground crews who kept it in the air, it was no less important. Its dual identity as both a trainer and a fighter made it unique, a symbol of how the Soviet Union adapted every available resource to meet the demands of total war. Post-war, the Yak-7 rapidly disappeared from service. By 1945, most had been replaced by Yak-9s and newer models, and they were not exported in significant numbers. Unlike some Allied fighters, which went on to long service careers in multiple countries, the Yak-7 story was largely confined to the Eastern Front. This limited its global recognition, but it also reinforced its identity as a uniquely Soviet aircraft, built for a specific purpose under specific conditions. Today, only a small number of Yak-7s survive in museums, restored as reminders of their wartime contribution. For historians and aviation enthusiasts, they represent an aircraft that embodies resilience and adaptation more than technical brilliance. They tell the story of an air force that could not afford to wait for perfect designs, but instead made do with what could be built quickly, modified pragmatically, and fielded in large numbers. In the broader sweep of aviation history, the Yak-7 stands as an example of how necessity can drive innovation in unexpected directions. It demonstrated that a trainer could become a fighter, that an improvised solution could evolve into a reliable weapon, and that in the chaos of war, versatility and availability could be just as valuable as raw performance. Its legacy endures not in fame or prestige, but in the quiet recognition that without it, the Soviet Union's path to eventual air superiority on the Eastern Front would have been far more difficult. Among the lesser-known chapters of the Yak-7's history are the forgotten missions, experimental uses, and adaptations that never achieved prominence but reveal the resourcefulness of Soviet aviation during the war. While the Yak-7 is remembered primarily as a fighter and occasional trainer, a closer look shows that it was employed in a variety of uncelebrated ways, often under pressing circumstances. One such use was in tactical reconnaissance. Although the Soviet Union possessed dedicated reconnaissance aircraft, the needs of the front frequently outpaced availability. Modified Yak-7s, stripped of some armament and equipped with cameras, were dispatched to fly photo reconnaissance missions over German lines. Pilots tasked with these flights operated at great risk, as the Yak-7 lacked the speed to escape German fighters or the armor of true ground attack aircraft. Nevertheless, their stability and long range made them suitable for short to medium-distance reconnaissance sorties. These missions provided valuable intelligence for Soviet ground offensives, though they were rarely publicized. Another area where Yak-7s were used creatively was in training and conversion roles, even during the height of the war. Some Yak-7Bs, instead of being committed to combat, were retained at training centers where they allowed novice pilots to transition from basic trainers to high-performance fighters. In this sense, the Yak-7 continued to fulfill its original purpose even while its brethren fought on the front lines. By 1943, two-seat Yak-7Vs were produced specifically for this role, proving invaluable in preparing a new generation of Soviet pilots for combat. The irony was not lost on those who recognized that the aircraft had returned to its roots as a trainer, even while others of the same type were battling over Stalingrad and Kursk. There were also attempts to push the Yak-7 into specialized combat roles. A handful of Yak-7s were tested with rocket rails to carry RS-82 or RS-132 unguided rockets. These weapons, already used on other Soviet fighters and the Il-2, expanded the Yak-7's ground attack capability. Though not widely adopted, these rocket-equipped Yak-7s flew sorties against German armored columns, contributing to the layered Soviet strategy of overwhelming ground forces with combined air and artillery strikes. In some regiments, this adaptation blurred the line between fighter and attack aircraft, giving commanders a flexible asset when Il-2s were unavailable. Another forgotten aspect was the Yak-7's use as a liaison and courier aircraft in emergencies. During periods when airfields were overrun or supply lines disrupted, Yak-7s were occasionally tasked with ferrying dispatches, critical spare parts, or even medical supplies across contested zones. Though such missions were improvised, they underscore the adaptability of the design and the desperation of wartime logistics. Experimental modifications also highlight what might have been. At least one Yak-7 was fitted with an experimental 37mm cannon to test its suitability as a heavy fighter capable of downing bombers or engaging tanks. While the concept showed promise in terms of firepower, the weapon's weight and recoil severely hampered the aircraft's handling. As the Yak-9 line was better suited for carrying heavy armament, the project was abandoned, but it illustrated how Soviet designers explored the Yak-7's potential limits. In some rear area units, worn-out Yak-7s were relegated to less glamorous roles such as gunnery training, target towing, or even experimental testing of equipment. Engineers used them to trial radio sets, gun mounts, and aerodynamic modifications that would later find their way into the Yak-9. Though these activities rarely made it into official records, they extended the service life of older Yak-7s and contributed indirectly to the advancement of Soviet aviation. Veterans who flew the Yak-7 often remarked on its reliability and forgiving nature, qualities that made it a favorite for both instructors and inexperienced pilots. While they recognized that the aircraft could not match the speed or agility of German fighters, they respected its ability to endure damage, deliver heavy firepower, and bring pilots home safely. Many remembered the Yak-7 not as a glamorous machine, but as a trustworthy partner in the sky, a reputation that ensured it maintained a loyal following, despite its eventual overshadowing by newer designs. These lesser-known uses and forgotten missions reinforce the Yak-7's identity as an aircraft of versatility and improvisation. It was not designed for reconnaissance, ground attack, or liaison work, yet it performed all of these roles when circumstances required. It was not planned as a long-term frontline fighter, yet it bore the weight of combat during some of the war's most decisive battles. In this sense, the Yak-7's unseen chapters tell us as much about the nature of the Eastern Front as its better-known history, that survival depended on adaptation, and that even a machine born for training could leave a lasting mark when pressed into the unforgiving crucible of war. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Yak-7's career as a frontline fighter was drawing to a close. Newer aircraft, particularly the Yak-9 and Yak-3, were steadily replacing it in combat units, bringing improved performance, lighter weight, and greater adaptability to the battlefield. Yet the withdrawal of the Yak-7 from frontline duty was gradual rather than sudden, and during this period it continued to play important roles both in combat and in support capacities. The Soviet Air Force faced a logistical balancing act, introducing new fighters while still maintaining large numbers of existing models. Factories in Saratov and elsewhere were producing Yak-9s at an accelerating pace, but the Yak-7 remained in production until mid-1944, with many regiments still equipped with it. These units often transitioned to mixed fleets, flying both Yak-7s and Yak-9s simultaneously until new deliveries arrived. This overlap ensured that Soviet fighter strength remained steady during the crucial offensives of 1943 and 1944, including Kursk, Operation Bagration, and the push into Poland. During this transitional period, Yak-7s were frequently assigned to secondary combat roles. They escorted bombers, patrolled rear areas, and attacked ground targets where the threat of encountering the Luftwaffe's latest fighters was lower. In this sense, the Yak-7 extended its service life by filling gaps that allowed newer aircraft to concentrate on the most critical missions. For example, during Operation Bagration in June 1944, Yak-7 still flew sorties against retreating German convoys and provided cover for Soviet troop movements, even as Yak-9s led the main fighter sweeps. Attrition also played a role in the Yak-7's gradual withdrawal. By 1944, many of the airframes that had entered service in 1942 and 1943 were worn from constant use, battle damage, and the harsh conditions of improvised Soviet airfields. While repairs kept them operational, their performance increasingly lagged behind both German fighters like the Bf-109G6 and the Fw-190A, and even the newest Soviet designs. Veteran pilots who had flown the Yak-7 in 1942 often remarked by 1944 that the aircraft felt outdated, slower, and less responsive compared to the sleek Yak-3s appearing on the front. As Yak-7s left frontline regiments, many were reassigned to training duties. Two-seat versions such as the Yak-7V became essential in pilot schools, allowing cadets to gain valuable experience in an aircraft that handled similarly to the Yak-9 but was more forgiving. This reuse of older Yak-7s ensured that even as their combat career ended, they contributed directly to preparing the next generation of Soviet pilots for war. Some Yak-7s also continued to be used in reconnaissance or liaison roles, especially in less contested sectors, making them useful until spare parts became scarce. The final combat use of Yak-7s occurred in 1944 and early 1945 as the Red Army advanced into Central and Eastern Europe. By then, only a handful of regiments still relied on them for combat, often in support or reserve roles. Most frontline engagements were handled by Yak-9s, Yak-3s, and the increasingly important Lavochkin La-7. Nevertheless, Yak-7s occasionally appeared in mixed formations, flying alongside their successors during the final campaigns against Germany. After the war, the Yak-7 disappeared quickly from Soviet service. Unlike the Yak-9, which was exported to several Allied nations and remained in use for years after 1945, the Yak-7 had no significant post-war career. It was viewed as an interim design, valuable during the desperate years of 1942 and 1943, but obsolete by the standards of the post-war era. The few surviving airframes were either scrapped or relegated to instructional airframes in aviation schools. The immediate consequences of its withdrawal reflected the broader trajectory of Soviet aviation. The Yak-7 had been vital during the Red Air Force's recovery and resurgence, but once more advanced fighters were available in sufficient numbers, there was little reason to keep it in active combat service. Yet the Yak-7's withdrawal did not diminish its contribution. It had bridged the critical gap between survival and superiority, ensuring that the Soviet Air Force could maintain pressure on the Luftwaffe until decisive shifts in the air war could be achieved. Thus, the Yak-7's withdrawal from combat was not marked by dramatic last battles or singular moments of glory. Instead, it faded from the skies as newer aircraft replaced it, leaving behind a record of steady, reliable service. Its disappearance was as pragmatic as its introduction, a machine that had done its job, fulfilled its purpose, and then made way for successors better suited to the final phase of the war. In this quiet exit lay the final testament to its role, not a fighter of legend, but a fighter of necessity, one that carried the Soviet Union through some of its darkest hours until brighter machines could take its place. The historical significance of the Yak-7 lies less in dramatic achievements and more in the essential role it played in a transitional period of the war. It was never hailed as the finest Soviet fighter, nor did it become a symbol of air supremacy. Instead, it embodied a pragmatic response to dire circumstances, ensuring that the Red Air Force could field an effective and adaptable aircraft at a time when survival was paramount. In the context of design evolution, the Yak-7 stands as a pivotal link in the Yakovlev fighter lineage. From its roots as a trainer, it demonstrated the flexibility of the Yakovlev design philosophy, prioritized simplicity, ruggedness, and rapid adaptation to the realities of war. These lessons carried directly into the Yak-9, which went on to become the most produced Soviet fighter of the conflict, and into the Yak-3, renowned for its agility. Without the Yak-7, this progression would have been slower and more difficult, leaving a critical gap in Soviet aviation capabilities during 1942 and 1943. The Yak-7's wartime reputation among pilots was nuanced but generally positive. It was not a machine that inspired romanticism or awe, but one that inspired trust. Pilots valued its stability, forgiving controls, and ability to withstand damage. For young aviators, it was a forgiving introduction to combat flying, and for veterans, it was a reliable platform that could accomplish a variety of missions. This blend of characteristics made it one of the unsung workhorses of the Red Air Force, a machine that carried countless airmen into battle and brought many of them safely back. From a strategic standpoint, the Yak-7 helped fill a void in Soviet air defenses during a period when the Luftwaffe still retained superiority in many sectors. Its presence in large numbers allowed Soviet commanders to keep up sustained pressure on German forces, even when individual engagements often favored German aircraft. In this way, the Yak-7 contributed to the gradual erosion of Luftwaffe dominance, a process that culminated by mid-1943 with decisive Soviet victories in the air over Kursk and beyond. Post-war memory has often overlooked the Yak-7, overshadowed by its more glamorous successors. Yet historians and aviation specialists recognize its place as a key transitional aircraft. It was a design born of necessity, and it served its purpose with quiet efficiency. In museums and collections today, surviving Yak-7 airframes stand as reminders of a chapter in aviation history, defined not by perfection, but by resilience and adaptation under pressure. Its legacy also extends beyond technical achievement to the broader narrative of Soviet endurance in the Second World War. The Yak-7 story reflects the Soviet Union's capacity to improvise under fire, to turn even a trainer into a fighter, and to mobilize its industrial and human resources in ways that ultimately shifted the balance of the air war. For every celebrated machine that captured the headlines, there were others like the Yak-7, whose steady service formed the backbone of victory. In the larger scope of aviation history, the Yak-7 illustrates how war often accelerates innovation through necessity rather than ideal conditions. It proved that utility and adaptability could be just as decisive as raw performance. Though it never enjoyed the global recognition of Spitfires, Mustangs, or Messerschmitts, Its contribution to the Eastern Front was no less real. It gave the Soviet Union time to recover, regroup, and eventually seize the initiative in the skies. Today, when remembered, the Yak-7 is celebrated not for what it aspired to be, but for what it accomplished despite its origins. From trainer to fighter, from a stopgap measure to a frontline weapon, it played a part in shaping the outcome of the greatest air war in history. Its legacy, though understated, remains secure. The Yak-7 was the aircraft that bridged survival and resurgence, an unheralded yet indispensable instrument of Soviet victory.